Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Somebody sent a question over that I wanted to record a little bit of a response to. They said, I've recently become very concerned about my 15-year-old sister's well-being, and I'm worried that she's straying away from the deen. It seems that being Muslim isn't really all that important to her, and now she's making choices and decisions in her life that are very concerning. It's weighing incredibly heavily on me, but I do not know what to do. Any advice or help would be appreciated. So there was a few things that came to mind when reading this. This is coming from an older sibling. And I wanted to direct my advice, I guess, in two streams. The first is toward, let's say, the sibling. But not just the sibling, obviously, in this specific scenario, but really anybody who feels like they are straying away from their deen. They know logically that they should be practicing, that they want to be practicing even, but that they can't seem to muster up the care, they can't seem to muster up the energy, and maybe they want to understand why and how to break out of that. The second side of the advice will be toward any kind of older siblings who are dealing with this with younger siblings, but also toward anybody who's in a position, let's say, of care towards another individual. Maybe it is an older cousin, maybe it is a friend, and they're concerned maybe about somebody who's in their care, or somebody who they can reach out to, and trying to kind of get them out of whatever cycle or rut that person is in. So to begin with, inshallah, I think it's important for us to realize for ourselves that the journey of trying to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's not always going to be a simple and kind of easy path. We want to believe that once we make the intention of coming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it's simply just about, I want this and I'm going to try and everything will go easily. And sometimes we think this because, of course, we know, there are many narrations that talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making things easier for the believer, right? For example, when you leave, the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam telling us that, if you leave something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will replace it with something better. But it's important for us to also remember that this ease that will come from Allah, right? We know that with every difficulty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also creates an ease. With usr comes yusr, right? And that's emphasized. So, with every difficulty comes, you could say, two eases. Not to go too much into, let's say, analysis of those verses. But the question is then, is this ease going to come immediately? Not necessarily, because there is a degree of test that Allah will also put us through, right? A test of our sincerity. And that sincerity is something that is difficult to have immediately. And one of then the first layers, let's say, and that we have to peel back when we're coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is this first round of insincerity, right? It's not to say that this is a universal experience or that everybody will feel this, but I think this is common enough for me to maybe just reflect on it in case somebody could benefit. Number one, we hope that there's going to be automatic kind of positive emotions. And sometimes there is immediate positive emotions. But there's also some difficult emotions that we feel when we come close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, if we are very aware of our shortcomings, when we're aware of our sins, sometimes we want to run as far away from Allah as possible because, and may Allah protect us from that, right? But because when you come to Him and you become aware then of your guilt, you have to face it. That creates within us negative emotions that we feel like we need to run away from. And so the journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes requires that we have to overcome those. We have to look them eye to eye. And we have to remember Allah's mercy is greater than my sin. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is greater, and that by my confrontation with my sin, not only am I coming face to face with my reality, but I'm also coming face to face with the reality that it is only through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I'm going to be able to relieve this feeling. And that feeling will go away. That feeling of immense guilt and immense pain, this is something that is a part of the process of tawbah. It's a part of the process of repentance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the end goal of that tawbah, the end goal of that repentance is not that you will always constantly be thinking about those negative feelings. No. Eventually that process has to develop to the point where you say, I do feel really bad about it, but I went to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I tried to do what I could in my power to make a change. I've made a sincere intention not to go back to this sin. And that is enough for me to trust that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hopefully, inshallah, will give us forgiveness. And that seed then, when you're able to go through that process, you're able to plant a seed of hope that inshallah will eventually grow into something that will remove or at least reduce that feeling of guilt. But if we run away from the feeling of guilt in the beginning, we'll never be able to plant that seed. And so if we feel, for example, that maybe one of the reasons why we're moving away from Allah, why we're straying away from the deen, why we're having a hard time, even, for example, coming to prayer, is because we are feeling feelings of guilt about what we have done, feeling like Allah won't forgive us, it's important for us to realize that first layer of difficulty is something that it is temporary and you will overcome it. That feeling of guilt is something that is not just coming from, let's say, also your ego and your thought process that you're hearing here, right? Because we like to convince ourselves sometimes that, we are, your ego and your nafs sometimes just wants you to avoid those negative feelings, right? We want to avoid them, we want to rationalize them away, justify them, avoid the confrontation because we want to satisfy ourselves in the short term, not the long term. But there's another entity that's also trying to highlight and overemphasize these negative feelings in us to the point where we don't go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that entity is the shaytaan. This is something that is not popular. It's not popular for us to talk about this because for some people, unfortunately, the concept of shaytaan has been instilled in them in a way that creates a lot of fear, where they almost feel like, and this is actually something that we see in other religious discourses, right? With other religions, the concept of the devil is almost viewed as a power or an entity on a similar level of God. Of course, in Islam, that's not true. The devil, the shaitan, is nothing but a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nothing can come your way, no harm can come your way except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it for you. And so the shaitan, we simply seek the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the shaitan. That's why we say things like A'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan ar-rajim. We seek protection from Allah from the shaitan. So I say this to say the shaitan is one of the entities who, when you are coming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is going to convince you and remind you and kind of create, let's say, an incentive within you to be like, you know what, just avoid this, man. It's boring, it's difficult, it feels painful. Those thoughts, you have to respond to them with A'udhu billahi min ash-shaytan ar-rajim. You have to be willing to sacrifice the need for immediate gratitude in that moment and say, I'm going to push through that negative emotion and I'm going to plant the seed of Allah's forgiveness. How? By saying the good words, by saying astaghfirullah al-azim, by doing the good deeds, right? Praying doing some salah, by doing, for example, any sort of righteous deed that immediately, once you've done that, you've already broken past and you know that you planted a seed with Allah. And that once you come a step to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you come walking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He comes running to you. These are from the promises of Allah. I'm not telling you here anything except that which we know through the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So, from that point, inshallah, we can, I hope then this sets the stage, right? This sets the framing that coming to Allah requires that we face those negative emotions internally, and that's kind of maybe one of the layers that we have to overcome. Now, somebody might say, listen, my journey or my barrier to Allah is not these negative emotions, it's a lack of emotions entirely. I don't feel anything at all. I feel like I've been so away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that my heart is numb. My heart is cold, and we ask Allah to protect us from reaching that point. But the reality is there are people who feel like that. Number one, don't look for the immediate gratification. So with the people who are feeling negative emotions, they want sometimes to feel an immediate removal of that negative emotion. For the people who don't feel anything, they might be seeking an immediate placement of a positive emotion when they come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's still that immediate gratification need, that's still something that's coming from the ego. You're still looking for something immediate. So there has to be a degree of humility where you recognize for yourself, be like, listen, yeah, I don't feel anything right now, But a part of that is because of my own distance. A part of that is because my heart isn't where it needs to be. A part of it is because maybe my heart has become polluted through my own actions. And so I need to give it some time to nourish it a little bit so that it feels something. That is a point of humility. And we know, of course we know, that all the narrations about things like arrogance, right? Sometimes we have the arrogance to believe that because I came to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right now, immediately, Allah should give me exactly what I want right now. And that's where you have the humility to say, listen, I've been away from Allah. It's not my place to think right now, automatically, I'm going to feel something. I'm going to have an overwhelming emotional experience. You can ask Allah for it and you could hope for it. But if you make that a condition of the actions that you present to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we go back to the idea of the tests, right? You're failing that test of sincerity because you are now creating conditions for you to do the actions. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, do the actions for Him alone. And Allah, when those actions are sincere, Allah will then create within you these awakenings. Allah will create within you this spiritual revival, inshallah ta'ala. So I hope we kind of touched on a little bit here those two aspects, right? The aspect number one of coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through negative emotions, number one, and number two, coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through that feeling of numbness, accepting the humility that we need to have there. And the emphasis in both of these spots, and with both of these challenges, is what? Action. The emphasis here is that at the end of the day, what you have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are your actions, your positive thoughts, your positive hopes. These things are good and they have value in themselves. However, they are not complete in their value until they translate to action. And it is important that we don't allow the ego to convince ourselves that we need to have some grand, significant, overwhelming action to justify the step that we take with Allah. So we might tell ourselves, I've been away for so long, so, I'm going to come back in Ramadan where I'm able to fast and do this and do that. Or, maybe we say, I have so many shortcomings, so, next time I read the Quran, I'm going to read 50 pages. These are tricks of the ego. These are tricks of feeling then. These are all things that we're trying to trick ourselves into believing that if we do a grand gesture, then we're going to have the immediate gratification. So we feel like if we withhold, then now we can, make up for it. No, you're planting small seeds. And those small deeds, those small actions, those are the ones that you're presenting to Allah, knowing how small they are. That's a sign of sincerity. Knowing that in you coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this does not compensate for your distance, this does not compensate for your shortcomings. That is the sign of sincerity, inshallah ta'ala. So now I want to shift the conversation a little bit to an individual who wants to, let's say, advise somebody who is going through a hard time. Actually, let me rephrase this. Not going through a hard time. Somebody who seems like they are straying away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Somebody who is making decisions that are concerning, choices that are concerning, that kind of show that Islam does not have the value that they need to have. One thing that we need to maybe keep in mind is that if we, based on what we just discussed, the process of coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a challenging one that requires kind of overcoming things like what we just previously mentioned. And that is a deeply spiritual journey. It is a deeply personal journey, and it's something that takes time. And different people are at a different point in it and are at have different capacities to, let's say, immediately put those types of words or those types of concepts to practice. So what is then the role of a person who is caring for someone? Maybe it's your younger sibling, maybe it's your child, maybe it's whoever. What is your role in helping them be able to do that? If we know that negative emotions and numbness are two of the big challenges, seeking short-term gratification, immediate gratification, are some of the big barriers that are in the way, then the role of, let's say, a mentor, the role of a caring friend or an older sibling or a parent is, number one, to help them be able to be patient toward the long-term gratification. So when you come, for example, and you're kind of putting immediate pressure on them to, why don't you start praying immediately right now? Why don't you quit this bad habit? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And it's not to say that you shouldn't give that advice. Giving that advice requires a lot of knowledge of a lot of contextual details that you're in the best place to to decide, inshallah, as you know, I'm out of the picture right now, right? So you need to look at the details in your story and figure out if that's the best thing for you to do. However, there's always going to be a long-term process there. And so rushing them because the weight is heavy on you, because you are pained seeing what they are going through and what they're doing to themselves, feeling like you need to immediately resolve it, it might not be the best tactic. So it might be better for you to approach it with a gentleness and with a patience that shows them that you will be there for them unconditionally, that you will be there for them as an emotional support, and as a friend, and as a supporter, and as a person who cares for them, regardless of where they are in that journey with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, is this to say that we justify the haram that they might be doing or that we defend it? Absolutely not. But it's to say that you are building a relationship that is not contingent. It is not relying on them following your advice immediately, because their following of your advice there are so many variables that go into it. From their perspective, from your perspective, being able to give the advice in the best way and whatnot. And so the relationship cannot be contingent on following that advice, because what ends up happening in that situation is that they're going to lose a potential source of emotional support that they might need. Not only of emotional support, but of spiritual support as well. Somebody who is thinking of them in a positive way and making dua for them. Somebody who is, giving them gentle reminders towards khair, even if it's not, let's say, a direct challenge to maybe the specific haram that they might be doing, or the specific wrong thing that you're trying to correct in them. Just to illustrate that example, you have a sibling, for example, who, let's say, is smoking, right? You can't make the only thing that you are giving them spiritually about quit smoking, quit smoking, quit smoking. No, because Allah. No. Give them other sorts of spiritual nourishment as well, right? Share with them a verse here and there, right? Show them just a general kindness. Bring to light the relevance of the bigger pictures, right? So I say this to say that you need to be that support in the long term, and that requires patience, that requires not rushing that they accept your advice. It requires that when you see them doing harm, I'm not saying, for example, you see somebody, doing drugs or doing something crazy in front of you, and you just say, well, I'm going to wait in the long term. I'm not saying that, but I'm talking about the process of giving advice, the process of building that relationship. You know what I mean? So the other aspect then, because we mentioned that some of the emotions that a person like this has to overcome could be a numbness or some negative feelings, things like guilt and things like, these things can add up. And so they do need a support of positive emotions coming from somebody who they know loves them for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, somebody who they know loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because then you are almost acting then as a representative to them, and to Allah is the best of examples. But in those moments, they might actually be viewing you as a representation of Allah's love for them. And so when you continue to treat them with kindness, continue to treat them with gentleness, continue to build a relationship with them outside of the context of this advice, that can create within them the feeling of hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because what are we if not conduits, what are we aspiring to be if not conduits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, if not people who are delivering the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to other people? Just like Allah, just like we're taught, of course, through the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, giving us the advice of have mercy towards the creation, so that the one in the heavens, in the skies, will have mercy upon you. And so it's not something for us to belittle the value of that mercy. Now, somebody might say, yeah, well, sometimes we need to advise harshly. Sometimes we need to do, that's a different topic. That is an exceptional situation sometimes that requires, of course, somebody make a balanced and reasonable judgment call. What we're talking about here is building relationships, the relationships that should be built. If you are in the position of providing a religious advice to people, your relationship with them has to be on the basis of mercy. That has to be the absolute foundation, so that even when in a moment you have to be a little bit more firm, a little bit more harsh, it is not forgotten that there is a deep basis of love and mercy, that they will be unquestionably certain that is where your words are coming from. So the next piece of advice that I'll give is a little bit more practical. This is in terms of actually, let's say, building a meaningful relationship with your siblings, your friends, etc., who you want to advise. One of the common things that we'll tell people, or that people, let's say, will hear, is be a good friend to them before being a kind of a religious mentor. And some people, they might interpret this and say, well, the best thing that I could give them is religion, and the best thing I can give them is the deen, and so that is the way that I could be the best friend. And so sometimes we get defensive about that concept, but I want to make it clear. If somebody feels like the only thing that you are mentioning to them, the only basis for your relationship is religious advice, they will sometimes feel like you have stopped being a real human being to them. If you can't have a conversation outside of a discussion about religion, they might feel like they cannot relate. They might feel like, because to them, maybe religion is not taking a high priority. They'll feel like when you're giving me religious advice, you're coming from a whole different mentality, a whole different world. Why should I take your advice? Why should I listen to you? And so it's critical that, especially with siblings, especially younger siblings, that an active effort is taken to build interests and hobbies, and to kind of share each other's interests in order to create a mutual appreciation, a mutual love, and mutual trust. So for example, maybe you see that your siblings like a certain show or a certain activity or a certain whatever. Spend the time to take real interest in understanding why they like these things, to learn about them, to share that hobby with them, to do things together, and to build that bond over something that isn't necessarily religious. If they're straying away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if they're straying away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the language of purely like deen language or religion language, that might not be the best way to reach them. They need to know that you understand them on a human level, on a core level. And so, taking the time to, share other interests and talk and explore. And this is one of the challenges, especially for people who are, let's say, in the process of seeking religious knowledge and who are trying to develop themselves spiritually. Sometimes they become so immersed in that journey that they forget what it's like to do things outside of it. And this is something that, especially if you're trying to advise somebody who's away from it, you'll realize that the language has to be communicated on a human level. There has to be an understanding that, hey, you get me, you understand me. And then looking for the proper opportunities, the proper context in which to advise, right? You don't go up to somebody in the middle of the day when they're in the middle of playing something or doing something. You say, you know what? Did you think about death and what you prepared for your afterlife? They might not be in the headspace for that. And so the more time that you actually spend together, the more opportunities naturally will also occur where these types of reminders can come up naturally.